The skies over Varelia burned red as explosions lit up the royal capital of the alien world. The people ran in panic while defense towers roared to life, shooting beams at the enemy ships that had appeared without warning. Princess Alira stood at the center of the royal atrium, her lavender skin glowing beneath the crystal light as her handmaiden reported the unthinkable. Varelia had been breached by an unknown force. She tightened her silver gauntlets and stared at the palace gates as if waiting for something worse. The royal guards were rushing to formation, and her generals begged her to flee to the safe zone beneath the palace. But she refused, her voice sharp and proud, saying that a Varelian princess never runs from her duty. In a hidden chamber below, a human named Duran sat quietly, wearing simple clothes and watching a projection of the chaos from a crystal orb. He had been brought to Varelia as a cultural guest, an Earth's envoy studying peace through science and honor rituals. Now, all of that meant nothing as war touched every sky window and shook the palace walls. He stood slowly, not sure why his hands trembled or why his heart was pounding like a war drum. Suddenly, the chamber doors burst open and a glowing knight stumbled in, blood trailing from his silver armor before collapsing. The knight pressed something into Darren's hand, a crystal key unlike anything he had ever seen. Moments later, guards dragged the knight away and sealed the room, warning Darren not to move or interfere. But something in the key pulsed as it touched Darren's skin, lighting up like a living flame and whispering inside his mind, far above. Alira faced the council of her ancestors, giant holograms of long-dead warriors who judged her every move. They told her to prepare for full retreat, to abandon the lower city and lock down the ancestral vault, but her heart ached at the thought of sacrifice, and her mind returned again to the strange human guest beneath the palace. Darren had always looked harmless, curious, even foolish with his jokes and questions about their history. That's why she made that joke last night, offering him to try on the sacred armor of her ancestors during a ceremonial tour. She never expected the armor to actually respond to him, even flicker with ancient light as if recognizing him. Now she wondered if that wasn't a fluke, if the ancient systems had sensed something deeper inside him. The thought shook her, because no alien, not even a royal, had ever awakened the armor's soul since the time of the old kings in the sealed chamber. The walls shifted and the key floated from Darren's hand, unlocking a section of the floor with a mechanical hum. From the rising platform emerged the very armor Lyra had shown him in just silver, ancient, elegant. Humming with strange force, Darren stared at it, unsure whether he was dreaming or being dragged into someone else's legend. But when he reached out, the armor responded like it had been waiting only for him. Plates unfolded, shaped around him, and sealed with a radiant pulse that lifted him inches off the ground. His eyes widened as knowledge poured into his mind. Battle stances, names of ancient enemies, and maps of the old world lit with fire. He could feel his skin humming and his blood burning like something had awakened deep inside him. Upstairs, Lyra felt the shockwave roll through the floor and turned sharply toward the source. She didn't wait for her guards this time, running barefoot down the glass staircases toward the vault chamber. As she reached the door, it opened on its own, responding not to her royal blood, but to something inside the room. She gasped when she saw him standing there, glowing with power, the sacred armor now alive and wrapped around a human body. For the first time in her life, she didn't know whether to be terrified or amazed, but one thing was clear. The war outside was not the only thing about to change. Alira stepped slowly into the chamber, her breath caught between awe and disbelief as she looked at the glowing human in front of her. The sacred armor, long thought to be lifeless and symbolic, now pulsed with silver-blue energy across Darren's chest and limbs. He turned toward her, with wide eyes, clearly overwhelmed, but strangely calm, as if something ancient was guiding his actions. She spoke his name carefully, afraid the power surrounding him might react to her voice. Darren blinked, looking down at his armored hands like he didn't recognize them as his own. "I didn't mean to activate it," he said quietly, his voice echoing with a faint metallic tone. Alira's fingers hovered near her belt, unsure if she should summon her weapon or offer him her hand. The guards behind her froze, unsure whether they were witnessing a threat or a prophecy. Then the chamber's walls shimmered again, and the armor projected a map into the air bright. Clear and ancient, Alira gasped as she saw the paths of the first invasion, recorded only in the forbidden archives of the royal bloodline. How do you know this? She asked. Barely able to control the tremble in her voice, Darren looked at the map with confusion and said he didn't know what it meant. Only that the armor was showing him what was important. The projection zoomed into a mountain fortress far. Beyond the Varelian border, now surrounded by red enemy markers, that's where they're coming from, Darren said. His tone suddenly certain and sharp like a soldier's. Alira stared at him and for the first time saw not a guest, but a possible savior. The armor belonged to her great ancestor, Queen Thalira, a warrior empress who fought the darkness with fire and light. But Thalira had sealed the armor in this vault after her final battle, saying only a soul with no throne to protect and no crown to claim could wear it again. No Varelian could fulfill that. Bound by heritage and duty, but Daron had no such chains. He was an outsider, a human, someone with no claim to their power, and that made him the key. Alira stepped closer and placed her hand on the armor's chestplate, feeling it vibrate warmly beneath her palm. It chose you, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Suddenly, an alarm blared through the palace as explosions rocked the eastern towers. The enemy had breached the second wall. Communications were down across the capital. Daron instinctively stepped forward, the armor adjusting around him with sleek movement and silent strength. He turned to Alira and asked where the command center was, his tone now carrying quiet authority. She hesitated only a second before nodding and leading him up the corridor, guards parting without a word. Every servant, soldier, and noble they passed turned to stare, their eyes wide as they saw the sacred armor walking once again. The old stories had spoken of the armor's return in a time of great need, but no one believed it would happen in their lifetime, and none had ever imagined it would be a human wearing it in the war chamber. Generals argued loudly until Alira walked in with Daron beside her. All voices stopped at once as the glowing figure stepped forward and looked directly at the central war map. He pointed at the advancing enemy columns, and said they were being controlled remotely from the mountain fortress the armor shown earlier. The generals protested that the location had no strategic value and had been abandoned for decades. Darren didn't argue, he simply touched the war table in the armor, projected a secondary vision, showing enemy supply lines and hidden tunnels under the rock. The room fell silent again as everyone realized what they were seeing wasn't just data. It was live intel. Alira ordered the generals to prepare a small strike team and said she would lead it herself. But Daron shook his head and said no, he would go alone. The armor, explained, was connected to something deep inside that mountain, something that needed a single carrier. Alira stared at him, torn between royal pride and a growing sense of trust in the strange human. In the end, she nodded and placed her hand on his shoulder. Don't die in my ancestors' armor, she said, half as a command and half as a plea. He gave her a single nod before stepping into the teleport gate, glowing at the edge of the chamber. None of them knew what waited in that mountain, but the galaxy had just been reminded of an old truth. Sometimes the greatest power comes not from blood, but from being completely unknown. The teleportation device hummed to life as ancient light wrapped around Darren's armored form. A moment later, he vanished from the palace, reappearing at the base of a snow-covered cliff that reached into the clouds. The air was thin and sharp, and wind howled across the jagged rocks as if warning him to turn back, but the armor around him hummed with growing energy, guiding him toward a hidden entrance carved into the side of the mountain. He walked forward carefully, every step sinking into frost and crunching ice beneath his boots. The entrance looked like a natural crack in the stone. But as he approached, symbols on the wall began to glow. The armor responded, sending pulses into the stone, and the hidden doors opened silently with a hiss of air. Inside, the tunnels were smooth and old, made of metal far stronger than anything Earth had ever known. Faint blue lights lit the way as he moved deeper, passing statues of armored warriors frozen in eternal poses. Most held weapons pointed downward, their eyes closed, as if sleeping and waiting to be awakened. The deeper he went, the more the armor reacted. Flashing memories across his mind like pieces of a puzzle, he saw flashes of battles long ago, great beasts of smoke and fire. Armies crushed beneath waves of red metal, skies full of lightning. He shook his head, trying to focus, but the armor pushed forward, pulling him toward something ancient and unfinished. Suddenly, the tunnel ended at a chamber with a high ceiling and a giant machine pulsing in the center. It looked like a heart made of crystal and steel, glowing with raw energy, each beat sending ripples through the air. He stepped closer, and the armor detached slightly from his chest, forming thin cords of light that reached into the machine. The connection triggered another vision, a woman in the same armor, standing where he stood, screaming as the machine collapsed. Then darkness fell, and he saw a war that was never recorded, buried by royal shame and sealed away. The armor didn't just hold power, it held memory, and that memory was now his. Behind him, a hiss echoed, and enemy soldiers emerged from the shadows. Black armored beings with sharp rifles and emotionless helmets. They opened fire, but the armor reacted before he could think. Forming a shield of light that absorbed the blasts, he spun and raised his hand, and a surge of energy burst out, sending the attackers flying into the walls. His eyes widened as he realized he hadn't meant to do that. It had acted on instinct, like the armor was protecting itself through him. More soldiers arrived, but this time, Duran met them head-on, dodging fire and striking with fists wrapped in glowing energy. Each blow shattered armor and stunned enemies. And soon, the chamber fell quiet again. He stood over them, breathing heavily, feeling both exhausted and alive. Then the machine pulsed one final time, sending out a wave of light that spread through the mountain and beyond. Back in the palace, Alira felt it hit her chest, a soft thrum like a whisper calling her name. She clutched the balcony railing and stared out toward the distant peaks where the light had emerged. All of Aurelia could see it now, a beam of energy firing into the sky like a signal flare. The people stopped fighting for a moment and looked upward, their hearts shaken by something they didn't understand. In the command chamber, the generals stared at the beam, silent and unsure of what it meant. Alira turned and declared that the ancient machine had awakened, and it had accepted the human as its new voice. None dared to argue, for they had seen the prophecy in the old songs, though many once called it myth. In the mountain, Daron stood quietly, the armor now still, the machine dark again. The voices in his mind faded, leaving behind a clear understanding this was just the beginning. He looked at the fallen enemies, and then at the crystal remains of the heart engine. Somehow, what he had done here had changed the balance of power across the planet. He didn't know what came next, but he knew the enemy would not stop now. As he stepped out of the chamber and into the snowy wind once more, the mountain behind him sealed shut with ancient power, and far away, in a black command ship orbiting the world, someone else took notice of the flare. A shadowed figure turned to its crew and gave a silent nod as the invasion changed shape entirely. The war for Varelia had only just begun, and now the humans were no longer outsiders. Asterisk Daron moved swiftly down the mountain path, the armor keeping his body warm and protected as storm winds whipped across the cliffs with each step. The snow parted before him, reacting to the armor's energy as if the world itself recognized the return of the sacred force. He didn't feel like a warrior, but the armor made him move like one, fluid, balanced, confident. Every time his foot touched the frozen ground, the armor adjusted his weight and kept him upright, no matter how slippery the ice. Behind him, the hidden chamber disappeared beneath shifting rock, sealed by energy that even he could no longer sense. He had done what the armor wanted, but he didn't understand what the next step was. Daron only knew the enemy had seen that light, and they would come faster now, high above, inside the command ship orbiting Varelia. The figure cloaked in black metal stepped forward. Her name was Commander Seika, and she was not like the foot soldiers Daron had fought. She was older than most Varelian cities, her body enhanced with ancient implants from the Forbidden Moons. when she saw the energy flare from the mountain. Her eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in excitement. The weapon has accepted a host. She said to her second in command, a pale creature with no mouth and long steel fingers. He signed an answer in silence, and Seika nodded, already planning the next strike below in the palace. Alira prepared her city for what was coming. The flare had changed everything. No longer was the battle a random invasion. Now it was a hunt. She stood before a table where her commanders laid out defense plans with shaking hands. They looked to her for guidance, but she could see it in their eyes. They had lost hope until the beam of light showed them something impossible. The armor was no longer myth. And now they had to believe in it because there was no other choice left. Alira tightened her gloves and ordered all remaining royal airships to be repositioned around the capital's outer edge. She spoke quickly, clearly, with authority that left no room for debate, though she had trained all her life for diplomacy, in tradition. Something inside her had shifted when she saw the armor return. She was no longer just a princess. She was now a leader in a war that would decide her world's future. The people needed to see strength in her, not fear. She stepped onto a broadcast platform and sent her voice across the city's speakers, her image glowing in every tower and marketplace. "We do not stand alone," she said as the wind blew through her hair and her guards bowed low. "The ancient armor has returned, and it has chosen a bearer who fights for all of us," she continued, her voice steady and strong. Across the city, civilians paused, stunned by her words and the glowing flare that still flickered faintly in the sky. Some wept, some cheered, and some simply looked toward the mountains and whispered prayers. Meanwhile, Darren reached the lower valley, where a royal patrol waited for him. Unsure of how to approach, they raised their weapons at first. But Alira's direct order crackled through their cums, telling them to kneel and escort him home. The lead guard, a tall female with 4 eyes and a scar across her cheek, bowed and called him Champion of the Flame. Darren didn't know what that meant, but the armor buzzed slightly in approval. He followed them into the transport skimmer. Nay soared toward the palace as enemy drones began to fill the sky behind them as they approached the capital. The sky darkened with the shadow of the invasion fleet. Commander Seika had sent her full force, now hundreds of warships shaped like claws and wings. Lyra stood at the palace, gates waiting for Darren, her royal robes replaced by sleek armor of her own. When he stepped out, the two locked eyes for a long moment, something silent passing between them. "You returned," she said calmly, though her heart pounded like a battle drum. "I said I would," Darren replied, and the armor shifted slightly, as if nodding too. Behind them, the city's lights burned bright as every citizen prepared for the coming siege. No one knew how long they could hold. But one thing had changed since yesterday. Hope had a shape now, and it walked among them in silver armor. The air was filled with the low roar of engines as the enemy fleet settled above, Borrelia like a storm waiting to break. Dark shapes covered the sky, blotting out the stars. While the capital prepared itself for its last stand, Duran stood beside Alira on the palace wall, watching the ships descend in perfect formation. He could feel the armor react to their presence, heating slightly across his chest like it was waiting for a command. Alira glanced at him, her hands clenched at her sides. But her voice was calm when she spoke. "They've never deployed this many ships before," she said as her eyes traced the lead vessel's path. "They know you activated something they fear," she added, her voice low but clear. Darren didn't answer right away, instead closing his eyes and letting the armor guide his thoughts. He felt something strange, then a pulse from within the enemy fleet. A familiar thread of energy that matched what he found in the mountain, there after the core, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Alira frowned and asked what he meant. But before he could explain, the alarm sirens began to wail from every direction. Drones and assault pods rained down toward the surface, their black trails slicing the sky. Anti-air weapons lit up the dark like lightning. But the invaders were too many and too fast. Soldiers rushed through the palace gates, shouting commands and moving into battle positions. Civilians were guided underground, while old defense systems long thought useless came online again. The city shook as the first pod slammed into the outer shield, sending ripples of pressure across the walls. Darren turned to Alira, who gave a single nod before drawing her sword. "You know what to do," she said firmly. Then ran toward the front lines with her elite guards at her back. Darren leapt from the wall. Landing in a plaza already swarming with invaders, the armor caught him easily, and with a burst of speed, he slammed into the enemy like a bolt of energy. His hands glowed, striking faster than he thought possible, and every motion from the armor felt natural. The invaders tried surrounding him, but the armor anticipated every move, creating shields and strikes without delay. People watching from windows cheered as they saw the armored figure fighting for their survival above the city. Commander Seka watched the chaos unfold on her screen, her sharp eyes never leaving the glowing form of the human. Her officers reported losses on multiple fronts, and her jaw tightened with fury. "This is not a prophecy," she hissed through clenched teeth. "This is interference," she growled. Slamming her fist onto the command console, she ordered her most elite hunter squads to focus all fire on the human. "They are not to return unless he is destroyed," she commanded, her voice echoing through the ship. Meanwhile, Alira cut through wave after wave of attackers, her sword burning with royal energy passed down through her bloodline. She fought like the warrior queens of old, and her people followed her with growing courage. Then her path crossed with Darren's again in the center of the city, where a massive walker unit towered above the burning streets. The two nodded to each other. No words needed, and charged the machine from opposite sides. Darren struck the legs with crushing blows, shattering the joints while Alira leapt onto its back and pierced the control core. The explosion sent debris flying, but the two emerged from the smoke unharmed. All across Virilia, the people began to believe again. Hope was no longer just a story. It had taken form in flesh and steel, but far above. Saika activated something older than any ship. She whispered to the shadow engine hidden within the planet's orbit, and a second signal answered her from deep space. It was not a fleet or a bomb, it was something worse, something buried and long forgotten. She smiled coldly as the stars rippled above her and something massive stirred beyond the light on the surface. Darren suddenly froze as the armor pulsed with warning. He turned toward the sky and saw the stars shifting unnaturally, like something large was moving toward the world. Alira followed his gaze, and for the first time, she looked truly afraid. Whatever was coming next, it would not be like anything they had faced before. Asterisk, the sky twisted above. Aurelia, as a black shape larger than any ship, began to descend from the edge of space. It moved like a silent beast. No engines, no flame, only shadows. In a terrible presence that made the air feel heavier, Alira and Duran stood frozen at the palace gate, staring up at the shape that now cast darkness across the entire city. Even the invading armies paused their attack, unsure if what approached was ally or death. The armor on Darren's body vibrated with strange patterns, unlike anything it had done before. He dropped to one knee as a sudden wave of pain hit his chest, like the armor was trying to protect him from something he couldn't see. Alira rushed to his side, placing her hand on his shoulder, but the energy pulsing from his body made her step back. "It's not a ship," Darren said as the pain faded just enough for him to speak. "It's alive," he added, staring upward as the sky turned darker and the stars vanished. The black form finally stopped moving and hovered above the capital like a dead moon. Its surface shifted constantly, flowing like oil and forming strange shapes that never stayed still. Inside the enemy command vessel, Commander Seka bowed her head as the entity answered her call. It was the old hunger, an ancient force from before memory, sealed away and forgotten. Space. She had not summoned it to destroy the world, but to awaken the final test for the sacred armor. She believed if the armor's power could survive the hunger, it could be controlled by her will. But as the creature opened its eyes to burning holes of red across the sky, something unexpected happened. Duran stood upright again, his armor shining brighter than ever before from the chess piece. A beam of golden light fired into the air and struck the black sky beast directly in its center. The creature screamed without sound, and every glass window across the capital cracked. Under the pressure, Alira fell to one knee from the shockwave. while her guards covered their ears and collapsed, but Darren remained standing. Arms raised, the armor guiding him like a vessel for something much older than himself. Suddenly, memories flooded his mind. He saw the first bearer of the armor. A being not of Varelia or Earth, but something between. The armor had never belonged. To one world it was a relic of balance, created by a council of extinct civilizations. Its purpose had always been to guard against the hunger whenever it returned. The hunger had devoured systems before and left no survivors, but now it had been struck for the first time in its endless existence. The scream of the beast grew louder until it cracked open the skies and poured out rivers of black mist that fell onto the city, wherever the mist landed. Soldiers turned mad, machines failed, and light itself seemed to flicker and die. Darren leaped from the palace steps, landing in the center of the plaza, now overtaken by the mist. He raised both hands and the armor responded with ancient symbols lighting up his arms and legs. Huh? Shield of white flame surrounded him. Pushing back the black mist with each pulse, Alira stumbled through the fog until she reached the edge of the shield and fell into the safety of its light, inside the circle. Her voice shook as she asked him what they were facing. Darren looked at her with eyes glowing gold and said it was something meant to erase entire histories, but it won't take yours, he said calmly as the light around them grew stronger. The armor shifted again, forming wings of light behind him and lifting him off the ground. He soared into the air, straight toward the heart of the hunger, which now sent tendrils downward to crush him. But the wings dodged with perfect speed and brought him close enough to the creature's eye. Duran plunged forward and released a burst of light from his hands into the red core. The sky shattered like glass as the creature convulsed and began to fall apart from the center. Light exploded in all directions as the ancient force unraveled under the armor's final judgment. Alira shielded her eyes as the city was bathed in pure light, and when the glow faded, the sky was clear again and the darkness was gone. The sky had returned to its natural color, soft blue breaking through the fading clouds of war. No more enemy ships hovered above Varelia, and the ancient creature that once cast fear across the land had vanished like smoke. A hush fell across the capital as people stepped from shelters, blinking into the light as if unsure it was real. The streets were quiet except for the soft hum of the armor as Duran floated down slowly into the palace courtyard. His body looked exhausted, but the armor still glowed with steady warmth, holding him upright like a protective shell. Alira ran to meet him, pushing through soldiers and civilians who had gathered to see what remained of the battle. When she reached him, he nearly collapsed, but she caught his arm and held him steady. "You stopped it?" she said, her voice shaking with a mix of relief. In disbelief, Darren nodded weakly, not trusting his voice as the last of the light faded from his eyes. The armor softened, some of its glowing lines dimming as if it, too, needed to rest. Across the city, bells rang in victory, their chimes echoing through the towers and broken ruins. Children laughed and pointed at the sky, while older citizens cried in silence. Remembering what they thought was lost forever, the people had believed the prophecy was only myth, yet now they had seen it with their own eyes, and standing in the center of that myth was a human, chosen by a power none of them could control. Alira turned to the crowd and raised her sword, shouting words of unity that spread like fire across the city. "He came not as conqueror," she declared, "but as protector of us all." The people raised their voices in return, chanting his name not as a stranger, but as a guardian. In that moment, Duran became something more than just a man in armor. He became a symbol, but not. All threats had vanished, and far above the world, hidden in a corner of space, Commander Seika watched with cold fury. Her fleet was broken, her plans shattered, but her hate remained untouched. She paced in the shadows of her failing vessel, her eyes locked on the last feet of Duran standing beside the princess. "He is not finished," she muttered, "and neither am I." Her advisors suggested retreat, but she silenced them with a single gesture and turned to a locked vault deep within the ship. Whatever she planned next would not rely on ancient beasts or forgotten gods. This time, It would be her hand alone that struck. Meanwhile, Darren rested inside the palace infirmary. The armor partially separated from his body for the first time since it chose him. He sat upright, breathing slowly, his muscles sore but his mind sharp. Alira entered quietly, placing her hand over her chest in a formal gesture of respect. "You should be resting," she said, though her tone was soft and kind. "I've rested enough," replied with a tired smile that reached his eyes. She pulled a chair beside him and sat without speaking for a moment. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was filled with unspoken truths and new understanding. Alira finally asked him if he would stay in Varelia. Now that the threat had passed, Duran looked down at his hands and then at the armor resting beside the bed. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I feel like it's not over yet." She nodded slowly, as if she expected that answer all along. "The people believe in you," she said. "And not because of the armor, but because of your heart." Duran turned his head and smiled faintly at her words. In that brief moment, something shifted between them, not as ruler and guest, but as to souls joined by battle and survival. Outside, the world began to rebuild, one brick and one hope at a time. The fire had not destroyed them. It had revealed who they truly were, and the one who wore the armor was no longer a stranger to their world. He was a part of it now. Varelia's twin suns rose slowly over the capital, casting warm gold light across the rooftops and broken walls. For the first time in weeks, the air carried no sound of engines or alarms, only the hum of rebuilding and quiet voices of hope. Flags of the royal house fluttered beside banners, stitched with a new symbol, Duran's armor, etched into silver fabric, a mark of unity. Children painted it on walls, while soldiers carved it into the handles of their blades. He had become more than a hero. Now, he was living proof that destiny could choose even an outsider inside the throne hall. Princess Alira stood tall before the high circle, delivering her address with fire in her voice and strength in her step. She spoke not of revenge or fear, but of peace and preparation. Vowing that no enemy would catch them unready again, the council, once stiff and proud, now nodded in agreement. Their eyes opened by what they had witnessed. Alira finished her words with a declaration that drew cheers from the gathered citizens. "We stand together not by blood, but by choice." Duran watched from the side, dressed in ceremonial robes. Over the still active armor, he had tried to remove it completely once, but the armor refused to let go, as if sensing its task was not yet finished. Though peace had returned, a shadow still lingered just out of sight. Commander Seika had vanished after the final battle. Her ship found drifting empty at the edge of the system. But Darren didn't believe she was going, not truly. She was a survivor. Like him, and she would return when they least expected it. That night, the palace held a celebration unlike any before. With glowing lanterns floating above the city and music echoing across the towers, alien foods from distant provinces were served in long halls. And even former refugees danced without fear. Darren stayed near the edge of the crowd, smiling quietly as he watched families reunite and warriors share stories. Alira found him there, dressed in simple royal armor with no crown on her head. "You hide from celebration now?" she teased as she stepped beside him. "I fight better than I dance," he replied. Laughing softly, she didn't laugh back, only looked at him with a calm expression and something deeper behind her eyes. "I want you to stay," she said simply, her voice lower than the music. Darren looked at her and didn't answer for a long time. Then he nodded once and smiled. Not as a warrior, but as a man who had finally found something worth protecting. "I will," he said. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding and remembrance, but also with quiet planning. Darren trained the new guard personally, teaching them not just to fight, but to think, to adapt, to question. He helped design better defenses with Varelian engineers, combining alien tech and human logic into something new. The armor adapted too, becoming lighter, faster, more responsive. With every passing week, it was no longer just a relic of the past. It was becoming something for the future. And with each step forward, the bond between Duran and Alira grew stronger. They didn't speak of titles or duty, only of the choices. they had made and the ones they still had to face. At night, they walked the garden paths together. Speaking of stars and stories and strange memories, the armor still shared, though peace reigned. They both knew that peace was never permanent, but they no longer feared what would come. Next, for Varelia was no longer ruled by tradition alone, and its people were no longer afraid of change. The world had nearly been lost, but it was saved not by force, but by faith in someone unexpected. And in the center of it all stood a human who had worn a joke like a crown and turned it into destiny. He had come as a guest, survived as a warrior, and remained as something more. He was no longer just the bearer of sacred armor. He was one of them now.